The smell hit me first. Not the usual mix of motor oil and energy drinks that always clung to David's apartment, but something stale and wrong. Like air that had been sitting undisturbed for too long. I stood in the doorway of Unit 2B, keys trembling in my hand, staring at the overturned coffee mug on his kitchen counter. The dark stain had spread across yesterday's newspaper, soaking through the sports section he never got to finish reading. My brother had been missing for 3 days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days since his manager at the auto shop called me, voice tight with confusion, asking if David was sick. 3 days since I'd driven through every street in Portland, checking his usual haunts, calling his friends, filing a police report that felt more like paperwork than hope. 3 days of sleepless nights and unanswered questions that echoed louder than any sound. The apartment felt like a photograph, frozen in time. His work boots sat by the door, mud still caked on the soles. A half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic sat on the counter, edges curled and dry. The television was paused on some action movie, the screensaver casting an eerie blue glow across the living room. Everything suggested he'd stepped out for just a moment, planning to return any minute. But David never left food out. Never left his tools scattered across the coffee table. Never disappeared without a word, especially not to me. I moved through the apartment like a detective, though I had no idea what I was looking for. The police had already been here, of course. 2 officers who spoke in practiced sympathy and took notes with the mechanical precision of people who'd seen this routine 100 times before. Missing person, adult male, no signs of struggle, probably took off on his own. They'd photographed the scene, asked about David's mental state, his finances, his relationships. Standard procedure, they assured me. Most missing adults turn up within a week. But they didn't know David like I did. They didn't know that he still called me every Sunday morning to complain about his professors, or that he'd been saving every penny from his part-time job at Brooks & Webb Custom Motors to surprise me with a weekend trip to the coast for my birthday next month. They didn't know that 3 years ago, when our parents died in that awful car accident on Highway 26, David had looked at me with tears in his eyes and promised we'd always take care of each other. David didn't run. David didn't abandon the people he loved, which meant something terrible had happened to him. I started in his bedroom, pulling open drawers with the guilty feeling of violating his privacy. His clothes were neatly folded, a habit our mother had drilled into both of us. His textbooks from Riverside Community College sat stacked on his desk next to a half-finished homework assignment about transmission repair. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be. That's when I found the journal. It was wedged between his mattress and the wall. A simple, black composition notebook with frayed edges. I almost missed it entirely, but when I leaned over to check under the bed, my hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. The journal fell open as I pulled it free, and David's familiar handwriting spilled across the pages in blue ink. I sat heavily on his bed and began to read, expecting to find typical young man thoughts. Complaints about school, notes about girls, maybe some sketches of car designs. David had always been artistic, even with mechanical things. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. Entry after entry detailing conversations, transactions, dates and times recorded with obsessive precision. Names I recognized and others I didn't. Dollar amounts that seemed impossibly large for a college student working part-time at an auto shop. And woven through it all, a growing sense of unease that leaped off the pages. Tyler's been asking about the inheritance again, read one entry from 2 weeks ago. Keeps bringing up how we could invest it better, says Rachel agrees. Don't know why they think they get a say in what Mom and Dad left us. My hands started shaking. Rachel was our older sister, and Tyler Brooks was David's best friend since high school. They'd gotten engaged 6 months ago in a whirlwind romance that had surprised everyone, including Rachel herself. But what inheritance was David talking about? Our parents had left us the house, which we'd sold to pay for David's college and my apartment deposit. There wasn't any significant money left over. I flipped through more pages, my confusion deepening with each entry. David had been tracking something, documenting meetings and conversations with the methodical attention of someone building a case. Phone calls logged by date and time. Visits to places I'd never heard him mention. References to the account, and the documents that meant nothing to me. Then I found the entry that changed everything. Found the papers in Tyler's truck today when he asked me to grab his toolbox. Emma doesn't know about the trust fund. Neither did I until I saw the bank statements. $180,000 sitting in an account with all our names on it. Rachel and Tyler have been managing it since Mom and Dad died. They've been taking money out every month, telling the bank it's for our quote, education and living expenses. But Emma's been paying my tuition herself. We've been scraping by while they've been living off our inheritance. The journal slipped from my numb fingers and hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. I stared at the wall, trying to process what I'd just read. A trust fund. Money that our parents had set aside for us. Money that Rachel and Tyler had been stealing for 3 years while I worked double shifts at the design firm to keep David in school. While I ate ramen noodles for dinner and wore the same 3 outfits to work every week. My sister had looked me in the eye at our parents' funeral and told me there was nothing left. She'd hugged me while I cried about the bills and the responsibility of taking care of David. She'd watched me struggle and sacrifice, knowing all along that there was enough money to make everything easier. I picked up the journal with trembling hands and kept reading. The entries became more frantic as they progressed, David's handwriting growing sharper and more urgent. He'd been investigating, digging deeper into the financial records. He'd discovered that Tyler's auto shop, the business that had supposedly been struggling to get off the ground, had received several large cash injections over the past 2 years. Cash that matched the amounts withdrawn from the trust fund. They're using our money to fund Tyler's business, one entry read. Rachel signed papers as our guardian, claiming she was investing our inheritance in a family business. But we're not family. We're just the source of their startup capital. The most recent entries were dated just 4 days ago, the night before David disappeared. His tone had shifted from confusion to anger to something that looked like determination. Gonna confront them tomorrow. Tyler asked me to work late at the shop, says he wants to discuss a promotion. Perfect opportunity to ask about the money. I've copied all the bank statements. I know about the forged signatures, the fake educational expenses, everything. Time for them to explain where our parents' money really went. The final entry was just 2 lines, written in David's careful block letters. If something happens to me, Emma needs to know the truth. The evidence is in the shop, hidden behind the tool cabinet in the back office. I sat in the growing darkness of David's bedroom, the journal clutched in my hands, as the full scope of the betrayal sank in. My sister and my brother's best friend had been systematically stealing from us for years. They'd used our grief and our trust to fund their new life together while we struggled to survive on our own. And when David had discovered their secret, he'd vanished. The logical part of my mind tried to find innocent explanations. Maybe David had misunderstood the paperwork. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for the money transfers. Maybe he'd gone away for a few days to think things through, and he'd come home with answers that made sense of everything. But the growing dread in my stomach knew better. David's last entry had been an insurance policy, a message left for me to find if something went wrong. He'd known he was walking into danger when he confronted Tyler that night. He'd prepared for the possibility that he might not come back. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Tyler's number, my finger hovering over the call button. What would I say? How do you ask your brother's best friend if he's been stealing money, and whether he knows why your brother has disappeared? How do you accuse your own sister of betraying the family she was supposed to protect? Before I could decide, a knock at the apartment door made me jump. I shoved the journal into my jacket and walked to the front door on unsteady legs. Through the peephole, I could see a man in his 60s with graying hair and kind eyes wearing a maintenance uniform. Miss Chen? He called softly. It's Frank Morrison, the building super. I wanted to check on you. I opened the door cautiously. Frank had always been friendly but respectful of boundaries. He'd helped David move in 2 years ago and had been patient about late rent payments during tough months. But we'd never had a real conversation beyond polite greetings in the hallway. I heard about David, he continued, his voice gentle. The police were here asking questions. I wanted you to know that if there's anything I can do to help. Something in his expression stopped me from giving him a polite dismissal. His eyes held a concern that went deeper than neighborly courtesy. There was something he wanted to say but wasn't sure how to start. Thank you, I managed. I'm just trying to understand what happened. David's not the type to just leave. Frank nodded slowly, glancing down the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers. Miss Chen, can I speak with you privately, inside David's apartment? There are some things I think you should know. The serious tone in his voice sent a chill down my spine, but I stepped aside to let him in. Frank moved carefully around the apartment, his experienced eyes taking in details I might have missed. He paused at the kitchen counter, studying the spilled coffee and the scattered papers. David's a good kid, he said finally. Polite, responsible, always pays his rent on time. In 15 years of managing this building, I've learned to read people pretty well. Your brother isn't the type to cause trouble or run away from his problems. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Frank continued. But lately, he'd been different. Worried about something. Last week, he asked me some unusual questions about building security, about whether anyone had been asking about him or trying to get into his apartment. He seemed nervous, like he was expecting some kind of trouble. My grip tightened on the journal hidden in my jacket. Did he say what kind of trouble? Not directly, Frank replied. But he did ask me to keep an eye on things. Said if anything happened to him, he hoped someone would look out for his sister. Frank's eyes met mine. That would be you. The weight of Frank's words settled over me like a heavy blanket. David had been scared enough to ask the building superintendent to watch over me. He'd been preparing for something dangerous, and he'd been right to be afraid. Mr. Morrison, I said carefully, did you see anything unusual the night David disappeared? Anyone coming or going from his apartment? Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was doing my evening rounds Tuesday night, checking the heating system in the basement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Around 10 o'clock, I heard voices in the hallway. David was talking to someone at his door. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the other voice. My heart started racing. Who was it? That friend of his, Tyler Brooks. The one with the auto shop. Frank paused, his expression troubled. But here's what bothered me. Tyler wasn't acting like he usually does when he visits David. He was urgent, almost aggressive. And when they left together about 20 minutes later, David didn't seem happy about it. The journal in my jacket felt like it was burning through the fabric. David's final entry echoed in my mind. Tyler asked me to work late at the shop. But according to Frank, Tyler had come to get David at 10 o'clock at night, well after normal business hours. Did you see them come back? I asked. Frank shook his head grimly. I waited up until midnight, just in case. David never returned. The next morning, his car was still in the parking lot, but he was gone. We stood in silence for a moment, the implications hanging between us like smoke. Tyler had been the last person to see David. Tyler, who had been stealing from us for years, who had the most to lose if David exposed the truth about the missing money. Miss Chen, Frank said slowly, I don't want to overstep, but I think your brother might have gotten himself into something dangerous. And I think whoever took him might not be finished. The chill in his voice made my skin crawl. What do you mean? Frank moved to the window and peered out at the parking lot below. Yesterday morning, I found someone had tried to jimmy the lock on David's mailbox. This afternoon, I caught a man I didn't recognize trying to get into the building. When I confronted him, he claimed he was looking for David, said he was a coworker. But I've met most of the guys from Tyler's shop, and this wasn't one of them. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If Tyler and Rachel had been stealing money, and if David had discovered their secret, then David wasn't just missing, he was a threat to them. And if they were desperate enough to make him disappear, They might be desperate enough to eliminate any evidence he'd left behind. "Mr. Morrison," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Frank turned from the window, his weathered face serious. "Of course. If I told you that I think David discovered something that could ruin some very important people, and that I think those people might have hurt him to keep him quiet, would you help me find the truth?" Frank didn't hesitate. "Miss Chen, I've been watching over the people in this building for 15 years. David is one of the good ones. If someone hurt that boy, then yes, I'll help you find the truth. Whatever it takes." Standing in my brother's empty apartment, clutching evidence of a betrayal that went deeper than I'd ever imagined, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and confusion that had consumed me for 3 days crystallized into something harder, more focused. David had been trying to protect me when he'd discovered the truth about our stolen inheritance. Now it was my turn to protect him. "Then we need to start by getting into Tyler's auto shop," I said. "David hid evidence there, and I think it might be the key to finding out what really happened to him." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a determination that matched my own. "I know the building where Tyler's shop is located. Used to do maintenance work there before I took this job. Getting inside won't be a problem." As night fell over Portland, I realized that the scared, grieving sister, who had walked into this apartment a few hours ago, was gone. In her place stood someone harder, someone who wouldn't stop until she found her brother and made the people who hurt him pay for what they'd done. David had left me more than just evidence in his journal. He'd left me a roadmap to the truth, and I was going to follow it wherever it led, no matter how dangerous the journey became. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Portland weather that matched the heaviness in my chest. I'd barely slept. David's journal spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. Every entry I reread revealed new layers of deception, new questions that demanded answers. Frank had agreed to meet me at 7 a.m., before the city fully woke up, and before Tyler's shop opened for business. I dressed in dark clothes, feeling ridiculous for the cloak and dagger approach, but knowing that stealth was essential. If Tyler really had hurt David, then showing up at his shop asking direct questions would only put me in danger. Better to find the evidence first, understand the full scope of what we were dealing with, then decide how to proceed. Frank was waiting by his truck when I arrived at the Morrison building, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a small canvas bag in the other. His maintenance uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, but his expression remained serious and determined. "Sleep at all?" he asked, studying my face in the dim morning light. "Not much," I admitted. I kept reading David's journal, trying to piece together the timeline. "Frank, I think this goes back further than I originally thought." David found bank statements showing withdrawals dating back 3 years, right after our parents died. "Rachel and Tyler have been planning this from the beginning." Frank's jaw tightened. "Using your grief against you. Taking advantage when you were most vulnerable." He shook his head in disgust. "Some people have no conscience." We drove through the quiet streets in Frank's pickup truck, passing early morning joggers and dog walkers who had no idea we were heading toward what might be a crime scene. The auto shop was located in an industrial district near the river, a collection of converted warehouses and small businesses that came alive during working hours but stood empty in the early morning. Brooks and Webb Custom Motors occupied the ground floor of a red brick building that had seen better decades. The large bay doors were sealed shut, and only a single light glowed in what appeared to be the office area. Frank parked across the street behind a delivery truck, giving us a clear view of the building while keeping us hidden from anyone who might be watching. "Tyler usually doesn't arrive until 8:30, I said, checking the time on my phone. "His partner Marcus comes in around 9. That gives us maybe an hour to get in, find whatever David hid, and get out." Frank reached into his canvas bag and produced a set of tools that looked far more sophisticated than anything a building superintendent should need. Lockpicks, tension wrenches, and devices I couldn't identify but that clearly weren't meant for fixing leaky faucets. "Before you ask," Frank said with a slight smile, I wasn't always in building maintenance. 20 years ago, I did security consulting for businesses that wanted to test their vulnerabilities, old habits and old tools. I stared at him with new respect and a growing sense that there was much more to Frank Morrison than met the eye. You're full of surprises. Your brother isn't the only one who's good at keeping secrets, Frank replied. Now, according to David's journal, the evidence is hidden behind a tool cabinet in the back office. Do you know the layout of the shop? I nodded, remembering the few times David had given me tours of his workplace. The office is in the rear corner, separated from the main work area by glass windows. Tyler's desk is there, along with filing cabinets and a large red tool chest against the back wall. Frank studied the building through binoculars, noting the security cameras and alarm systems. Basic setup. Cameras cover the front entrance and the bay doors, but there's a side door near the dumpsters that's probably just for employee access. If we're careful, we can get in without triggering anything. We crossed the street quickly, keeping low and staying in the shadows cast by the neighboring buildings. The side door was exactly where Frank had predicted. A heavy steel barrier with a commercial lock that looked formidable but apparently wasn't to someone with Frank's particular skills. He worked in silence, his weathered hands moving with surprising dexterity as he manipulated the lockpicks. Within 3 minutes, I heard the soft click that meant we were in. Frank held up a hand, listening for any sounds from inside, then slowly pushed the door open. The interior of the shop was darker than I'd expected, lit only by the pale morning light filtering through dirty windows. The smell of motor oil and metal shavings filled the air, familiar scents that reminded me of David working on my car in our parents' garage when we were teenagers. For a moment, the memory was so vivid that I almost expected to hear his voice calling out a greeting. Frank moved through the space like a professional, avoiding obstacles and checking for motion sensors. He led me past the hydraulic lifts and tool benches, past half-disassembled engines and stacks of tires, toward the glass-walled office in the back corner. The office door was unlocked, which seemed careless until I realized that the real security was probably in keeping people out of the building entirely. Tyler's desk was covered with invoices and work orders, the mundane paperwork of a small business that gave no hint of the criminal enterprise I now suspected was hidden beneath the surface. The red tool cabinet stood against the back wall exactly where I remembered it, a massive metal structure that reached nearly to the ceiling. Frank examined it carefully, running his hands along the edges and checking for hidden latches or secret compartments. "Help me move this," he said quietly. "If David hid something behind it, we need to pull it away from the wall." The cabinet was heavier than it looked, loaded with tools and equipment that rattled ominously as we shifted it. Frank produced a small flashlight from his bag and shined it into the narrow space we'd created between the cabinet and the wall. "There," he said, pointing to a manila envelope taped to the back of the cabinet. "Your brother was smart. Nobody would find this unless they knew exactly where to look." I reached into the gap and carefully peeled away the tape, my heart racing as I pulled the envelope free. David's handwriting on the front simply said, "For Emma," in the same careful block letters I'd seen in his journal. Inside were photocopies of bank statements, legal documents, and what appeared to be correspondence between Rachel and Tyler discussing the trust fund. But there was also something I hadn't expected. Photographs. Pictures of Tyler and Marcus meeting with men I didn't recognize, handing over envelopes of cash in parking lots and warehouse loading docks. "This isn't just about stealing our inheritance," I whispered, studying the photos. "They're using the auto shop for something else. Money laundering, maybe, or some kind of illegal transactions." Frank examined the documents over my shoulder, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "Your brother stumbled onto something much bigger than family theft. Look at these amounts." He pointed to a bank statement that showed deposits far exceeding what a small auto shop should be generating. "They're processing hundreds of thousands of dollars through this business." The implications hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't just discovered that Tyler and Rachel were stealing from us. He'd uncovered evidence of a criminal operation that involved far more money and probably far more dangerous people than my sister and her fiancé. No wonder he'd been scared. No wonder someone had been willing to make him disappear. "We need to get out of here," Frank said urgently. If this operation is as big as these documents suggest, then Tyler and Marcus aren't working alone. There could be people watching the shop, people who would hurt us if they knew we were here. I was about to agree when I heard the distinctive sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot outside. Frank immediately switched off his flashlight and motioned for me to crouch down behind Tyler's desk. Through the office windows, I could see headlights sweeping across the main shop area as a vehicle pulled up to the front entrance. "It's too early for Tyler," I whispered. "He never comes in before 8:30. Frank crawled to the window and peered carefully over the sill. "It's not Tyler," he said grimly. "It's two men I don't recognize, and they're coming to the front door." The sound of keys jingling and the front door opening sent adrenaline shooting through my system. These weren't employees arriving for work. These were people who had access to the building, people who felt comfortable entering before business hours. Frank grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back exit we'd used to enter. "Leave everything exactly as we found it," he whispered. "Move the cabinet back, make sure there's no sign we were here." We worked frantically, but quietly, repositioning the heavy tool chest and erasing any trace of our presence. The voices from the front of the shop were getting closer, and I could make out fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. Should have taken care of this problem days ago. The kid saw too much, asked too many questions. Need to find out what he told his sister. Frank's face had gone pale. He grabbed the envelope of evidence and shoved it inside his jacket, then guided me toward the side door we'd used to enter. But as we reached for the handle, we heard footsteps approaching from the other side. "Back window," Frank mouthed silently, pointing toward a small window high on the rear wall of the office. It was barely large enough for a person to fit through, but it was our only option. Frank boosted me up first, his strong hands supporting my weight as I squeezed through the narrow opening. I dropped to the ground outside and immediately turned to help pull him through. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might be too large to fit, but desperation gave him the flexibility to contort his body through the space. We landed in the alley behind the building, breathing heavily and trying to orient ourselves. The voices inside the shop were clearer now, and what I heard made me grab Frank's arm in terror. "The girl's been asking questions," one voice said. "Calling around, looking for her brother. She's going to be a problem." "Then we handle her the same way we handled him," another voice replied. "Make it look like an accident. Grief-stricken sister. Couldn't cope with her brother's disappearance." Frank and I looked at each other with the terrible understanding that we'd just overheard our own death sentence being planned. These weren't just thieves or small-time criminals. These were people who had already killed David and were now planning to kill me. We ran through the alley, staying low and moving as quickly as we dared. Frank's truck was parked 3 blocks away, but those 3 blocks felt like 3 miles as we imagined footsteps behind us and watched every shadow for signs of pursuit. When we finally reached the truck, we sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the envelope of evidence between us like a ticking bomb. The documents David had hidden proved that Tyler and Rachel were involved in something far more dangerous than simple theft, and the conversation we'd overheard confirmed that David was dead and that I was next. "We can't go to the police," Frank said finally. "Not yet. If this operation involves the kind of money these documents suggest, then there could be cops on the payroll. We need to be smart about this." I nodded, though every instinct was screaming at me to drive straight to the nearest police station and demand protection. What do we do with this evidence? How do we use it to find out what really happened to David? Frank started the truck and pulled into traffic, checking the mirrors constantly for signs we were being followed. "First, we make copies of everything and store them in multiple locations. Then we need to understand exactly what kind of operation we're dealing with. Your brother was thorough, but he was also just scratching the surface." As we drove back toward the Morrison building, Frank explained his plan. He had contacts from his security consulting days, people who could analyze the financial documents and trace the money flows without alerting the wrong people. He also knew investigators who specialized in organized crime, professionals who would understand the significance of what David had discovered. "But most importantly," Frank continued, "we need to make sure you're safe. These people have already shown they're willing to kill to protect their secret. Until we can build a case strong enough to bring them down, you're in serious danger. The weight of that reality settled over me like a crushing burden. My brother was dead, killed for trying to recover money that belonged to us. My sister had betrayed our family and was now part of a criminal conspiracy. And somewhere in Portland, dangerous people were planning my murder. But I also felt something else rising inside me, something harder and more determined than fear. David had died trying to protect me and expose the truth. Now it was my responsibility to finish what he'd started, to make sure his killers faced justice, and to honor the sacrifice he'd made. "Frank," I said as we pulled into the parking lot of his building, "I want you to know that I understand how dangerous this is. I know these people have already killed once, and I know they won't hesitate to kill again. But I can't just run away and hope this disappears. David died for this truth, and I'm going to make sure the world knows what happened to him." Frank studied my face in the morning light, perhaps seeing the same transformation that I felt happening inside me. "Then we do this right," he said. "We build an airtight case. We gather irrefutable evidence, and we make sure these people can't hurt anyone else, ever again." As we walked toward the building, the envelope of David's evidence tucked safely in Frank's jacket, I realized that my life had fundamentally changed. The scared, confused sister who had entered David's apartment yesterday was gone. In her place stood someone who understood exactly what she was fighting for, and exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to get it. David had left me more than just evidence. He'd left me a mission, a purpose that would drive me forward no matter how dangerous the path became. And with Frank's help, I was going to see that mission through to its conclusion, whatever the cost. The safe house wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of some shadowy underground location, Frank had taken me to a modest ranch home in a quiet suburb of Beaverton, complete with a white picket fence and rose bushes that clearly received regular care. The owner, a woman named Detective Sarah Martinez, greeted us at the door with the kind of professional warmth that suggested she'd handled situations like this before. "Frank told me about your brother," she said, leading us into a living room that looked more like a therapist's office than a police detective's home. "I'm sorry for your loss, and I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to get justice for David." Sarah had retired from the Portland Police Bureau 5 years earlier, but her connections and expertise in financial crimes made her invaluable for cases like ours. Frank had called her during our drive from the auto shop, using coded language that suggested they'd worked together before under circumstances that weren't entirely official. "Show her what we found," Frank said, settling into an armchair that creaked under his weight. "Sarah needs to see the full scope of what David uncovered." I spread the contents of the envelope across Sarah's coffee table, watching her expression grow more serious as she examined each document. The bank statements, the photographs, the correspondence between Rachel and Tyler, it all painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that went far beyond simple theft. "This is sophisticated," Sarah murmured, studying a series of deposit slips that showed money flowing through multiple accounts. "They're using the auto shop as a front for money laundering, probably processing cash for drug dealers or other criminal organizations. The amounts here suggest they're handling serious volume." She picked up one of the photographs David had taken, showing Tyler handing a thick envelope to a man in an expensive suit. "Do you recognize this person?" she asked, pointing to Tyler's contact. I shook my head, but Frank leaned forward for a closer look. "That's Vincent Corelli," he said grimly. "He runs numbers for the Torino family. If Tyler's doing business with him, then we're not just dealing with local criminals. This connects to organized crime." The words hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't just stumbled onto a family betrayal or even a small-time scam. He discovered evidence that could bring down a piece of a major criminal network. No wonder someone had been willing to kill him. No wonder they were planning to kill me. Sarah must have seen the fear in my eyes because she leaned forward and spoke in a gentle but firm tone. "Emma, I need you to understand something. What your brother found is incredibly dangerous, but it's also incredibly valuable. This kind of evidence could help law enforcement dismantle an operation that's been running for years." "But it got David killed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And now they want to kill me too." "Which is why we're going to be very careful about how we proceed," Sarah replied. We can't just walk into the police station with this evidence. If there are corrupt cops involved, or if word gets back to the wrong people, you could end up like David. Frank pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a recording app that was still running. We got audio of them planning Emma's murder. They're gonna make it look like an accident, a grief-stricken sister who couldn't handle her brother's disappearance. Sarah listened to the recording twice, her face growing harder with each repetition. "This is gold," she said finally. "Conspiracy to commit murder, admitted involvement in David's death, and evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise. But we need more before we can move." "What kind of more?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "We need to document the full scope of the operation," Sarah explained. "Map out all the players, trace the money flows, identify the sources of the cash they're laundering. Most importantly, we need to find out what happened to David's body." The clinical way she said it made me flinch, but I understood the necessity. Without physical evidence of David's murder, the case would be much harder to prosecute. His killers could claim he'd simply run away, that the threats we'd overheard were just tough talk. "How do we do that without getting killed?" I asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since we'd arrived, and it wasn't entirely reassuring. "We're going to use their own paranoia against them. They're worried about what David might have told you, what evidence he might have shared. We're going to let them think they're hunting you while we're actually hunting them." Over the next several hours, Sarah outlined a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying. I would return to my normal life, but with modifications. Hidden cameras in my apartment, a tracking device on my car, and a panic button that would bring help within minutes. Frank would maintain his cover as the building superintendent, while secretly documenting everyone who came looking for me. "They'll make contact," Sarah predicted. "They have to. As long as they think you might have evidence that could destroy them, they can't just wait and hope you'll go away. They'll try to find out what you know, and when they do, we'll be ready." The plan required me to act like a grieving sister, who was slowly accepting that her brother had abandoned her. I would make calls to David's friends, expressing doubt about his disappearance and wondering if maybe he had just needed space. I would post on social media about feeling lost and confused, creating the impression that I was emotionally unstable and potentially suicidal. "The goal is to make them think they won't need to kill you," Sarah explained. "If they believe you're going to self-destruct naturally, they might get careless. Reveal more information, make mistakes we can use against them." I understood the logic, but the thought of pretending to be weak and broken when I was actually filled with determination and rage felt like a betrayal of everything David had died for. Sarah seemed to sense my reluctance. "I know this is hard," she said gently, "but remember, every day we delay is another day they think they've gotten away with murder. This performance isn't about hiding your strength. It's about using it strategically." Frank had been quietly studying the financial documents while Sarah and I talked. "There's something else," he said, looking up from a stack of bank statements. "Emma, did David ever mention anything about your parents' life insurance policy?" I frowned, trying to remember. "Just that it paid for their funeral and helped cover some of the immediate expenses after they died. Rachel handled all of that paperwork." Frank and Sarah exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. "What aren't you telling me?" I demanded. "According to these documents," Frank said carefully, "there was a life insurance policy worth $400,000. But the trust fund for you and David was only funded with $180,000. The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. Rachel stole from the life insurance too. She didn't just take money from the trust fund. She took money that was supposed to help us deal with losing our parents." Sarah nodded grimly. "It gets worse. Look at the timing of the withdrawals from the trust fund. They correspond almost exactly with major purchases Tyler made for the auto shop. Your parents' death didn't just provide cover for the theft, it provided the startup capital for the entire money laundering operation." I felt something break inside me, a final barrier between grief and fury that I hadn't even known existed. Rachel hadn't just betrayed us after our parents died. She'd used their deaths as an opportunity to fund a criminal enterprise. She'd turned our family's tragedy into her personal lottery ticket. "I want to confront her," I said. my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. I want to look my sister in the eye and ask her how she could do this to us. That's exactly what we're going to do, Sarah replied. But not yet. First, we need to set the stage properly. Make sure we have everything we need to not just confront her, but to destroy her. Frank pulled out his phone and showed me a contact list he'd been building. I've been reaching out to people from my security consulting days. Tomorrow we're meeting with someone who specializes in financial forensics. She'll help us trace every penny that went through the auto shop and identify all the sources of the laundered money. And I've been in touch with a federal prosecutor who handles organized crime cases, Sarah added. Once we have a complete picture of the operation, we can decide whether to involve the FBI or handle this at the state level. The scope of what we were planning was overwhelming, but I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since David's disappearance. We weren't just seeking justice for my brother. We were going to dismantle an entire criminal network that had been using our family's tragedy as its foundation. As evening approached, Sarah insisted I stay the night at her house rather than return to my apartment. Tomorrow, you start your performance, she said. But tonight, you need to rest and prepare mentally for what's coming. I lay in Sarah's guest room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about David. In his journal, he'd written about feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what he'd discovered. He'd been afraid, uncertain whether he was strong enough to take on something so much bigger than himself. I wished I could tell him that he'd been stronger than he knew, that the evidence he'd gathered would ultimately bring down everyone who had hurt our family. But I also understood something that David might not have realized. This wasn't just about strength or courage. It was about patience, strategy, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of justice. David had made the ultimate sacrifice already. Now it was my turn to see his work through to its conclusion. The next morning, I woke to find Sarah already up, drinking coffee and studying crime scene photos on her laptop. Frank called, she said, without looking up. Someone broke into David's apartment last night. They didn't take anything, just tore the place apart looking for something. My heart started racing. Did they find the journal? No, because Frank moved it to a safe location after we left for the auto shop. But this confirms what we suspected. They're getting desperate. They know David left evidence behind, and they're running out of time to find it. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would make me look vulnerable and defeated rather than determined and angry. Sarah had coached me on body language, on how to carry myself like someone who was slowly breaking under the weight of grief and confusion. Remember, she said as I prepared to leave, your goal isn't to convince them you're weak. It's to convince them you're not a threat. Big difference. Frank was waiting in the parking lot of the Morrison building when I arrived, his face grim with concern. Are you ready for this? He asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure anyone could ever be truly ready for what we were about to attempt. What's the plan for today? First, we install the surveillance equipment in your apartment. Then you make some calls. Establish the pattern of behavior Sarah outlined. Tonight, we meet with the financial forensics expert. Frank paused, studying my face. Emma, I need you to understand something. Once we start this, there's no going back. These people have already killed once, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they feel cornered. Good, I said, surprising myself with the coldness in my voice. Because I'm not planning to give them the chance. As we walked into the building, I felt the weight of David's journal in my purse. A reminder of the brother who had died trying to protect me. Today I would begin the process of returning that protection, of making sure his killers faced the consequences of their actions. The scared, confused sister who had entered David's apartment just days ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood exactly what she was fighting for, and exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to win. David had started this fight, but I was going to finish it. And when I did, everyone who had hurt my family would discover that they had made a fatal mistake in underestimating the Chen siblings. The performance was about to begin, and I was ready to give the performance of my life. The text message arrived at exactly 2:47 a.m., 3 weeks after I'd started my carefully orchestrated performance of grief and instability. The number was blocked, but the message was crystal clear. We need to talk. Meet me at Riverfront Park tomorrow at noon. Come alone. R. Rachel. My sister was finally ready to make contact. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I forwarded the message to Sarah's secure phone. Within minutes, she called back, her voice alert despite the early hour. "This is it," she said. "Are you ready?" I was more than ready. The past 3 weeks had been the most difficult of my life, pretending to be broken while actually growing stronger, acting confused while methodically building an airtight case against the people who had destroyed my family. Every fake social media post about missing David, every staged conversation with Frank where I wondered aloud if maybe my brother had just needed space, every performance of vulnerability had been leading to this moment. "The wire is already in place," Sarah continued. "Frank will be positioned with the long-range surveillance equipment, and my team will be scattered throughout the park. Whatever Rachel says, we'll have it recorded and documented." The wire was a tiny device hidden in the button of my coat, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. We'd tested it dozens of times, and the audio quality was perfect. More importantly, it was connected to a GPS tracker that would allow Sarah's team to monitor my location in real time. I arrived at Riverfront Park 15 minutes early, wanting to scout the location and calm my nerves before the confrontation. The park was busy with lunchtime joggers and office workers eating sandwiches on benches, normal people living normal lives while I prepared to face the sister who had betrayed everything our family stood for. Rachel appeared at exactly noon, and I was shocked by how much she'd changed. The confident, put-together woman I remembered had been replaced by someone who looked tired, stressed, and constantly checking over her shoulder. Her expensive clothes couldn't hide the tension in her posture or the dark circles under her eyes. "Emma," she said, approaching cautiously. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," I replied, keeping my voice flat and emotionless. "I'm not sure I want to hear whatever you have to say." Rachel sat down on the bench beside me, maintaining enough distance to suggest she was afraid of my reaction. "I know you're angry about David disappearing. I know you think Tyler and I should have done more to help find him." The casual way she referred to David's murder as a disappearance made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay in character. "He's been gone for almost a month, Rachel. The police have stopped actively searching. I think we have to accept that maybe he just left." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Rachel said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. She thought I was giving up, accepting the story they'd crafted about David running away. "I think you're right. David was always impulsive, and maybe he just needed to start over somewhere else." "But why didn't he tell me?" I asked, letting my voice crack slightly. "I thought we were close. I thought he trusted me." Rachel reached over and touched my arm, a gesture that might have seemed comforting if I hadn't known the truth about her. "Maybe he didn't want to hurt you. Maybe he knew you'd try to talk him out of it. Or maybe something happened to him," I said, watching her face carefully. "Maybe someone hurt him." For just a moment, Rachel's mask slipped and I saw fear flash across her features. "Why would you think that? Who would want to hurt David?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging with feigned helplessness. "But I found some things in his apartment. Papers, documents. I didn't really understand what they meant, but they seemed important." Rachel went very still. "What kind of documents?" "Bank stuff, mostly. Financial records." There was something about a trust fund that I'd never heard of before. I paused, letting the words sink in. "Do you know anything about that?" The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. Rachel was clearly calculating how much to reveal, how much she could trust me with. Finally, she spoke in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Emma, there are things about our parents' estate that I never told you. Things I thought would be too complicated for you to understand while you were dealing with your grief." "What kind of things?" "There was more money than I initially said. A trust fund that was set up for you and David's education and future needs. I've been managing it, making sure the money is invested properly and used for the right purposes." The lie came so easily, delivered with such apparent sincerity, that I might have believed it if I hadn't seen the evidence of her theft. "How much money?" "Enough to make sure you and David never have to worry about finances," Rachel said. "But the thing is, some of that money has been invested in Tyler's business. The auto shop is doing really well, and we thought it would be a good way to grow the trust fund. So you're saying David knew about this money? Rachel nodded. He'd been asking questions lately, wanting to understand the investments better. Maybe he got overwhelmed by the financial complexity and decided he needed time to think things through. I marveled at how skillfully she was rewriting history, turning David's murder into a story about a confused young man who'd run away from financial responsibility. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have found her explanation plausible. But if there's money set aside for us, why have I been struggling so much? Why did I have to work extra shifts to pay for David's tuition? Because I wanted you to learn the value of hard work, Rachel said smoothly. The trust fund is for major expenses, for emergencies, for your future. Day-to-day expenses are supposed to come from your own efforts. The condescension in her voice was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to nod as if her explanation made sense. So what happens now? With David gone, what happens to his portion of the trust fund? That's complicated, Rachel said carefully. If David doesn't return within a certain time frame, if he's declared legally dead, then his portion would normally go to you. But there are legal procedures we'd have to follow. And if he comes back, then everything goes back to normal. The trust fund continues to grow, and you both benefit from the investments we've made. I could see the trap she was setting, the way she was trying to give me a financial incentive to stop looking for David, except that he was gone, let him be declared dead, and I would inherit his portion of the money. It was clever, offering me a bribe disguised as family inheritance. I don't care about the money, I said, which was partially true. I just want to know what happened to my brother. Rachel's expression hardened slightly. Emma, you need to understand something. David got involved with some people who aren't safe. People who might have given him reasons to disappear rather than face the consequences of his actions. What kind of people? People who Tyler knows through the business. Not criminals exactly, but people who don't like questions being asked about their financial arrangements. Rachel paused, studying my face. If David started investigating things he shouldn't have been investigating, he might have made some dangerous enemies. The implication was clear. David had brought his disappearance on himself by asking too many questions. It was a warning disguised as an explanation, a way of telling me that I could end up like David if I didn't drop my own investigation. Are you saying someone killed him? I asked, letting fear creep into my voice. I'm saying that if David is smart, he's somewhere far away from Portland, starting a new life where certain people can't find him, Rachel replied. And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions that might bring those same people's attention to you. The threat was delivered with the gentle tone of sisterly concern, but it was unmistakably a threat. Rachel was warning me that continuing to search for David would put me in danger, that the same people who had made him disappear were still out there and still willing to kill to protect their secrets. I just miss him, I said, letting my voice break. I feel so alone without him. Rachel's expression softened, and she moved closer to me on the bench. I know, sweetheart. I miss him too. But we have to be strong and move forward. David would want us to be happy, to live our lives. Maybe you're right, I said, wiping away tears that weren't entirely fake. Maybe I need to accept that he's gone and try to move on. That's exactly what you need to do, Rachel said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. Focus on your work, on building your own life. The trust fund will always be there as a safety net, but you need to find happiness in the present. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. This is Tyler's accountant. If you want to understand more about the trust fund investments, he can explain everything in detail. But Emma, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll stop looking for David. Stop asking questions about his disappearance. It's not healthy for you, and it's not safe. I took the business card and stared at it, as if wrestling with a difficult decision. I promise, I said finally. I'll try to move on. Rachel smiled and hugged me, and for a moment I remembered the sister who had comforted me when I'd skinned my knee as a child, who had taught me to drive, who had held me while I cried at our parents' funeral. The betrayal felt fresh and devastating all over again. I love you, Emma, she said as she prepared to leave. I know this is hard, but everything I've done has been to protect you and David. I hope someday you'll understand that." After she left, I sat on the bench for another 10 minutes, making sure she was truly gone before I activated the panic button that would signal Sarah's team. Within minutes, Frank appeared at my side, his face grim with concern. "How did it go?" he asked. "She confessed to everything," I said, pulling off the wire and handing it to him. "She admitted to the trust fund, to the investments in Tyler's business, and she essentially confirmed that David was killed for asking too many questions." Frank smiled grimly. "Then we have her." The recording was even better than I'd hoped. Rachel's voice was clear and distinct as she described the trust fund, the investments, and the dangerous people David had supposedly encountered. More importantly, she had implicitly confirmed that David was dead, and that his death was connected to his investigation of the money laundering operation. Sarah's team had also documented the meeting from multiple angles, capturing not just the audio, but also Rachel's body language, her nervous glances, and the way she'd constantly checked her surroundings. The combination of video and audio evidence painted a clear picture of a woman who was desperately trying to cover up her involvement in her brother's murder. But the most damaging evidence came from the business card Rachel had given me. Sarah's financial forensics expert had been monitoring the accountant's communications, and within hours of my meeting with Rachel, he had received a call instructing him to prepare doctored financial records that would support the false story about the trust fund investments. "They're scrambling," Sarah explained as we reviewed the evidence at her safe house. "Rachel's meeting with you was supposed to end the investigation, but instead it's given us everything we need to destroy their entire operation." The federal prosecutors Sarah had been working with agreed to fast-track the case, recognizing that we had uncovered something much bigger than a simple murder. The money laundering operation had been processing millions of dollars through Tyler's auto shop, and the evidence David had gathered could help law enforcement trace the funds back to their criminal sources. But first, we needed to find David's body. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb, Tyler's business partner, had been arrested on an unrelated charge and was looking for a way to reduce his sentence. When federal agents showed him the evidence we'd gathered, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. According to Marcus, David had been killed the night he'd confronted Tyler about the stolen money. Tyler had panicked when David threatened to expose the money laundering operation, and he'd struck David with a tire iron during their argument. Rachel had helped dispose of the body, dumping it in a remote section of the Columbia River where they thought it would never be found. The confession led to the recovery of David's remains and the arrest of Tyler, Rachel, and 3 other members of the money laundering ring. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, recorded confessions, DNA evidence, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had seen David at the auto shop on the night he died. The trial was a media sensation, with headlines about family betrayal and organized crime that made Portland's newspapers for weeks. Rachel's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been manipulated by Tyler, that she was a victim of his criminal enterprise rather than a willing participant. But the recordings from our park meeting destroyed that narrative, showing clearly that Rachel had been an active participant in covering up David's murder. Tyler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rachel received 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. The other members of the money laundering ring received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years, and the federal government seized assets worth over $2 million that had been processed through the auto shop. But the most satisfying moment came when the recovered trust fund money was returned to me. The full amount, plus interest, plus the life insurance money that Rachel had stolen. Enough to ensure that David's death had not been in vain, that his sacrifice had ultimately led to justice, not just for our family, but for all the victims of the criminal enterprise he had uncovered. I used part of the money to establish a foundation in David's name, focused on helping families who had been victimized by financial crimes. The rest I invested carefully, making sure that the security David had died trying to protect would be there for future generations of our family. Frank Morrison retired from building maintenance and became the foundation's security consultant, using his unique skills to help other families uncover evidence of fraud and abuse. Sarah Martinez came out of retirement to serve as the foundation's legal advisor, bringing her expertise in financial crimes to bear on cases that law enforcement might otherwise ignore. Standing in the courtroom as the judge read Rachel's sentence, I thought about David's final journal entry. If something happens to me, Emma needs to know the truth. He had been right to trust me with that responsibility, right to believe that I would see his fight through to its conclusion. The scared, confused sister who had entered David's empty apartment was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that justice sometimes requires patience, strategy, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth. David had made the ultimate sacrifice, but his death had not been meaningless. It had been the catalyst for bringing down a criminal enterprise and protecting countless future victims. As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Portland sunshine, I felt David's presence beside me, proud of what we had accomplished together. His killers were behind bars, his stolen money had been recovered, and his memory would live on through the foundation that bore his name. The Chen siblings had kept their promise to always take care of each other. David had protected me by documenting the truth, and I had protected his legacy by making sure that truth was heard. Justice had been served, and David could finally rest in peace. 5 years had passed since the gavel fell in that Portland courtroom, since justice had finally been served for David's murder. The city looked different now as I drove through the familiar streets, heading toward the anniversary memorial service we held every year at the small chapel where David's funeral had taken place. The cherry trees were in full bloom, painting the neighborhoods in shades of pink and white that reminded me of the hope that had emerged from our family's darkest chapter. The David Chen Foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd first established it with the recovered trust fund money. What had started as a small nonprofit focused on helping families victimized by financial crimes had evolved into a comprehensive support network that assisted hundreds of families each year. We provided legal resources, financial counseling, and emotional support to people who had been betrayed by those they trusted most. Our offices occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse in the Pearl District, the same neighborhood where I'd once struggled to pay rent while Rachel and Tyler lived off our stolen inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were using their ill-gotten gains to help other families avoid the same devastation we'd endured. Frank Morrison still served as our security consultant, though his official title was Director of Investigative Services. His background in security consulting had proven invaluable as we'd expanded our operations beyond Portland. We now had satellite offices in Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver, each staffed with former law enforcement professionals who specialized in uncovering financial fraud and family betrayal. Sarah Martinez had officially come out of retirement to serve as our legal director, bringing her decades of experience in financial crimes to bear on cases that traditional law enforcement might overlook. Her network of contacts in police departments and prosecutors' offices across the Pacific Northwest had helped us secure convictions in dozens of cases involving elder abuse, inheritance theft, and family financial manipulation. The Foundation's most recent success story involved a case remarkably similar to my own. An elderly man in Eugene had discovered that his daughter and son-in-law were systematically draining his retirement accounts while claiming to manage his finances. Unlike David and me, however, this family had somewhere to turn for help. Our investigators had documented the theft, our legal team had built an airtight case, and the perpetrators were now serving prison sentences, while the victim received full restitution. Each case we handled reminded me why David's death had to mean something beyond just punishment for his killers. Every family we helped, every criminal we exposed, every victim who received justice was a testament to the evidence David had died gathering. His sacrifice continued to protect people he would never meet, in ways he could never have imagined. But success hadn't erased the personal cost of everything we'd endured. The relationship with what remained of my family had been permanently severed the day Rachel was sentenced. Her parents, my aunt and uncle who had raised her after our grandparents died, blamed me for not showing mercy to their daughter. They believed I should have found a way to forgive Rachel's betrayal, to help her avoid prison rather than ensure she faced the full consequences of her actions. I tried to explain that justice wasn't about revenge, but about preventing future victims, about ensuring that Rachel and Tyler could never again use positions of trust to hurt vulnerable people. But grief and denial had made them unreachable, and I'd eventually stopped trying to maintain relationships that only brought pain to everyone involved. The isolation had been difficult at first, losing not just David and Rachel but the entire extended family network I'd once relied on for support. But I'd discovered that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and the people I'd surrounded myself with at the foundation had become something deeper than colleagues or friends. Frank had become the protective older brother I'd never had, someone who understood the weight of carrying other people's secrets and the responsibility of using difficult knowledge wisely. Sarah had filled the role of a mentor and maternal figure, guiding me through the complex emotions that came with seeking justice for those who couldn't seek it for themselves. Our newest team member was someone I'd never expected to work with, Marcus Webb, Tyler's former business partner, who had provided the testimony that led to the discovery of David's body. After serving 18 months in federal prison for his role in the money laundering operation, Marcus had been released and struggled to find legitimate employment. His cooperation with law enforcement had made him a pariah among Portland's criminal networks, but his intimate knowledge of how financial crimes operated made him invaluable to our foundation. It had taken months of careful consideration before I'd agreed to meet with Marcus, and even longer before I'd offered him a position with the foundation. The man who walked into our offices was dramatically different from the cocky young entrepreneur who had helped Tyler build their criminal empire. Prison had humbled him, and the weight of David's death had given him a perspective on consequences that he'd lacked in his younger years. Marcus now served as our financial crimes analyst, using his understanding of money laundering techniques to help us trace stolen funds and identify criminal networks. His ability to think like a criminal had helped us solve cases that traditional investigators might have missed, and his genuine remorse for his role in David's death had gradually earned him the trust of our entire team. The anniversary memorial service was held each year on the date David's body had been recovered from the Columbia River, rather than on the date of his murder. Sarah had suggested this approach, arguing that we should commemorate his return to us rather than his loss. It was a subtle distinction, but it had proven therapeutic for everyone who had loved David. The small chapel was filled with familiar faces as I arrived. Frank and his wife Margaret sat in the front row, along with Sarah and her partner Janet. Marcus sat toward the back, still uncomfortable with his place in our chosen family but committed to honoring the memory of the man whose death had changed his life. But the most meaningful presence was that of the families we'd helped over the past 5 years. Dozens of people who had found justice through the foundation had come to pay their respects to David, understanding that his sacrifice had made their own recovery possible. They brought flowers and handwritten letters, sharing stories of how our work had helped them rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman from Seattle, whose grandson had been stealing her Social Security benefits, approached me after the service with tears in her eyes. She wasn't related to us despite sharing our last name, but she'd become something of an adopted grandmother to me since we'd helped her recover her stolen money. "David would be so proud of what you've built," she said, pressing a small wrapped package into my hands. "He saved my family, even though he never met us." Inside the package was a small jade pendant, carved in the shape of a guardian dragon. Chinese tradition held that such dragons protected families from harm and ensured that justice would always prevail. It was a perfect symbol for what David had become in death, a guardian spirit whose influence extended far beyond his own family. As the memorial service concluded and people began to disperse, I found myself walking alone through the cemetery where David's headstone stood among hundreds of others. The inscription we'd chosen was simple but meaningful. David Chen, beloved brother and protector of truth. His courage continues to shield the innocent. Frank approached quietly and stood beside me, both of us lost in memories of the young man who had died trying to protect his family. "He'd be amazed by what you've accomplished," Frank said finally. "The foundation, the families you've helped, the criminals you've put behind bars. He started something that's going to outlive all of us." "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," I admitted. "Every case we handle reminds me that there are probably dozens more we'll never hear about. People suffering in silence, being victimized by their own families, with nowhere to turn for help." Frank nodded thoughtfully. That's the burden of this work. Knowing that we can't save everyone doesn't diminish the importance of saving those we can. David understood that when he chose to document Tyler and Rachel's crimes instead of just walking away. As we walked back toward the chapel, I reflected on how much my understanding of heroism had changed over the past 5 years. David hadn't died in some dramatic confrontation or noble sacrifice. He'd died alone in a dirty auto shop, killed by people he'd trusted, because he'd tried to protect money that belonged to his family. But his quiet courage in documenting the truth had ultimately protected hundreds of other families from similar betrayals. True heroism, I'd learned, wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about making difficult choices when no one was watching. About doing the right thing even when it put you in danger. About leaving evidence of the truth for others to find even if you might not survive to see justice served. The foundation had received a significant grant the previous month from a national organization focused on elder abuse prevention. The funding would allow us to expand our operations to 3 additional states and develop a training program for law enforcement officers who handled financial crimes. David's story would become part of that training curriculum, helping future investigators understand the importance of family financial crimes and the devastating impact they could have. But perhaps the most meaningful development had come just 2 weeks earlier, when I had received a letter from Rachel. It was her first communication with me since her sentencing 5 years ago, written from the women's correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. The letter had been brief and formal, lacking any real admission of guilt or expression of remorse. Instead, it had focused on her plans for life after prison, her hope that we might eventually rebuild some kind of relationship, and her belief that David would have wanted us to forgive and move forward as a family. I'd read the letter multiple times, searching for any sign that Rachel truly understood the magnitude of what she'd done. But it had become clear that even 5 years in prison hadn't fundamentally changed her perspective. She still saw herself as a victim of circumstances rather than as someone who had actively chosen to betray her family and participate in murder. Sarah had advised me not to respond to the letter, at least not immediately. She's approaching parole eligibility in 2 years, Sarah had explained. This letter might be more about creating a positive impression for the parole board than about genuine remorse or family reconciliation. I'd ultimately decided not to respond, at least not yet. Rachel would have to demonstrate real change and genuine accountability before I could consider any kind of relationship with her. The Foundation's work had taught me that forgiveness without consequences often enabled further victimization, and I refused to put other potential victims at risk for the sake of family harmony. As evening approached, I returned to my apartment in the same Pearl District building where I'd lived during David's disappearance. I'd considered moving several times over the years, but something about staying connected to that place felt important. It was where I'd first realized David was truly missing, where I'd begun the investigation that would ultimately bring down his killers. My apartment looked different now, filled with artwork created by grateful families we'd helped, photographs from Foundation events, and awards recognizing our work in the field of victim advocacy. But David's journal still sat on my bookshelf in a place of honor, a reminder of where everything had started. I'd never shared the contents of that journal with anyone except Frank, Sarah, and the prosecutors who'd needed it for evidence. David's private thoughts about discovering the theft, his growing fear as he'd uncovered the scope of the criminal operation, his final preparations for confronting Tyler, those intimate details belonged to him, not to public record or Foundation publicity. But I'd recently begun work on a book about our experience, focusing not on the sensational aspects of family betrayal and murder, but on the practical lessons families could learn to protect themselves from financial abuse. The book would include resources for recognizing warning signs, steps for documenting suspicious activity, and guidance for seeking help when traditional authorities seemed unresponsive. The working title was The David Chen Guide to Family Financial Protection, and all proceeds would benefit the Foundation's work. It felt like the right way to honor David's memory while extending his protective influence to families we might never meet directly. My phone rang as I was preparing dinner, and Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Emma, I hope you're sitting down," she said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with a federal prosecutor in Chicago. They want our help with a case involving a crime family that's been using auto shops to launder money. The familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a new case coursed through my system. How big? Multi-generational. They think it goes back 20 years, involves dozens of businesses, and has victimized hundreds of families. Sarah paused. The techniques are identical to what Tyler and Rachel were doing. They want to use David's case as a template for understanding the full scope of the operation. I smiled, feeling David's presence in the synchronicity of the moment. On the anniversary of his death, new evidence had emerged that his sacrifice might help dismantle an even larger criminal network than the one that had killed him. When do we start? I asked. Frank's already booking flights for tomorrow morning. Marcus thinks he might recognize some of the names from his days in Tyler's operation. We could be looking at the biggest case the Foundation has ever handled. After hanging up the phone, I walked to my window and looked out at the city lights reflecting off the Columbia River. Somewhere in those waters, David's body had rested for months while his killers thought they'd gotten away with murder. But his careful documentation had ensured that the truth would eventually surface, that justice would eventually be served. Now, 5 years later, that same evidence was still protecting families, still exposing criminals, still ensuring that David's death had meaning beyond the immediate punishment of those who'd killed him. His influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives he would never know about, in ways he could never have imagined. Tomorrow would bring a new challenge, a new opportunity to use David's legacy in service of justice. But tonight, on the anniversary of his return to us, I felt nothing but gratitude for the brother who had loved me enough to document the truth, even when he knew it might cost him his life. The scared, confused sister who had entered David's empty apartment 5 years ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that the greatest tribute to love was ensuring it protected others, that the most meaningful legacy was one that continued to serve justice long after its creator was gone. David had kept his promise to always take care of me, and I would spend the rest of my life keeping my promise to take care of the truth he'd died preserving. The Chen siblings had found a way to protect each other across the boundary between life and death, and that protection would continue as long as there were families who needed someone to stand up for them. Standing in my apartment, surrounded by reminders of the lives we'd saved and the justice we'd served, I whispered a quiet thank you to my brother. His sacrifice had transformed not just my life, but the lives of countless others who had found hope in their darkest moments, because David Chen had chosen courage over silence. The work would continue, the mission would expand, and David's protective spirit would keep watching over families who needed someone to care enough to document the truth and fight for justice. His story had ended, but his legacy was just beginning. The flight to Chicago arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of weather that seemed to match the gravity of the case we were about to undertake. Frank sat across from me on the plane, reviewing financial documents that the federal prosecutors had sent ahead, while Marcus studied photographs of the suspected crime family members, with the intensity of someone trying to piece together a puzzle from his own past. Sarah had remained in Portland to coordinate with our local cases, but her influence was felt in every folder we carried. Her methodical approach to building financial crime cases had become the Foundation's trademark, and the Chicago prosecutors had specifically requested our involvement because of her reputation for creating unshakable evidence chains. The Torino family operation made Tyler and Rachel's money laundering scheme look like amateur hour. According to the FBI briefing documents, the family had been using auto shops, restaurants, and construction companies across the Midwest to process drug money for over 2 decades. The sophistication of their operation was breathtaking, involving shell companies, international wire transfers, and a network of corrupt officials that reached into multiple state governments. But what made this case particularly relevant to David's story was the discovery that the Torino family had been expanding their operations to the West Coast, using Vincent Corelli as their advance scout to identify potential partners and establish new laundering channels. Tyler's auto shop had been one of their test sites, a small-scale operation designed to evaluate whether Portland could support a larger criminal enterprise. This meant that David hadn't just stumbled onto a local theft and murder conspiracy. He'd accidentally uncovered the early stages of a major organized crime expansion, and his death had been ordered not just to protect Tyler and Rachel's stealing, but to prevent exposure of a much larger criminal network. The realization that David's murder had been part of something so vast was both overwhelming and, oddly, comforting. His death hadn't been meaningless or random. He'd died because he'd posed a genuine threat to criminals who operated on a national scale, because his documentation skills and moral courage had made him dangerous to people who had never even met him. Agent Patricia Novak met us at O'Hare Airport, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in organized crime financial investigations. She'd been tracking the Torino family for 8 years, building cases that had resulted in dozens of arrests, but had never managed to reach the family's leadership. "Your brother's evidence changed everything," she told me as we drove through Chicago's industrial districts. "We knew the Torinos were expanding west, but we didn't understand their methodology. David's documentation showed us exactly how they identify potential partners, how they test new markets, and how they eliminate threats to their operations." The auto shop where the Chicago operation was based looked remarkably similar to Brooks and Webb Custom Motors. Same layout, same mix of legitimate car repair and hidden criminal activity. Same facade of small business respectability hiding a sophisticated money processing center. But the scale was dramatically different. Where Tyler had been handling thousands of dollars per week, the Chicago operation was processing hundreds of thousands. Agent Novak led us through the evidence room where they'd stored materials seized from the auto shop and related businesses. Financial records filled dozens of boxes. Computer hard drives were stacked like building blocks, and photographs covered every available wall surface. It was a testament to the scope of the investigation, but also a reminder of how complex financial crimes could become when they were allowed to grow unchecked. "The problem we're facing," Agent Novak explained, "is that the Torino family learned from what happened to your case. They've become much more careful about documentation, much more paranoid about potential informants. Traditional investigation techniques aren't penetrating their security." Marcus stepped forward, studying a photograph of Vincent Corelli meeting with a man I didn't recognize. "They didn't just learn about security," he said quietly. "They learned about family dynamics. Look at these partnership arrangements." He pointed to a series of financial documents. "They're not just recruiting business partners anymore. They're targeting family operations, people who have built-in loyalty structures and personal reasons to stay quiet." The insight was brilliant and disturbing. The Torino family had studied David's case and concluded that their vulnerability had come from working with unrelated partners, like Tyler and Marcus, people who could betray them without destroying their own families. Their new approach focused on corrupting existing family businesses, creating situations where exposure would devastate entire family networks rather than just individual criminals. Frank was examining security camera footage from one of the suspected Torino businesses, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Emma, you need to see this," he said, rewinding the footage and pointing to a timestamp from 3 weeks earlier. On the screen, a woman who looked remarkably like an older version of myself was entering the business with 2 teenage children. The family resemblance was unmistakable, and Agent Novak's explanation made my blood run cold. "Maria Santos, age 42. She owns a small restaurant that we believe is being used for money laundering. The children are her daughter Carmen, 16, and son Miguel, 14. Both attend local schools, both are reportedly excellent students with bright futures." The implication was clear. The Torino family wasn't just threatening Maria Santos with prison if she didn't cooperate with their money laundering operation. They were threatening her children, using the same family bonds that made their partnerships more secure to ensure absolute loyalty from their partners. "How many families are involved?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "We've identified at least 30 businesses across 6 states, Agent Novak replied. "Conservative estimate is that they're holding approximately 200 family members hostage through these arrangements. Parents, children, grandparents, all trapped in criminal operations they can't escape without risking their loved ones' safety." The scope of the victimization was staggering, but it also presented an opportunity. Unlike Tyler and Rachel, who had chosen to participate in criminal activity for personal gain, these families were being coerced into cooperation. They were victims rather than willing partners, which meant they might be willing to help law enforcement if they could be convinced their families would be protected. "What do you need from us?" I asked. Agent Novak smiled grimly. "We need you to do what you did in Portland. Build relationships with the victims, document their stories, create evidence chains that will hold up in court. But most importantly, we need you to help us understand how to approach these families without triggering the kind of violence that killed your brother." The assignment was both exciting and terrifying. We would be operating undercover, posing as potential business partners, while actually documenting criminal activity and building cases against the perpetrators. But unlike our investigation of Tyler and Rachel, this operation involved professional criminals who had already killed to protect their secrets. Our first target was Maria Santos and her restaurant, a small family establishment in a Chicago neighborhood that had been struggling economically for several years. According to FBI surveillance, the Torino family had approached Maria 6 months earlier with an offer to help her business succeed, requiring only that she allow certain customers to pay their bills in cash that would be processed through her accounting system. The arrangement seemed innocent enough on the surface, but the amounts of cash being processed far exceeded what a small restaurant could legitimately generate. Maria was being used to launder drug money, and her children were being held as insurance to ensure her continued cooperation. Frank would pose as a restaurant equipment supplier, giving him legitimate reasons to visit the business and observe the money laundering operation. Marcus would play the role of a potential investor, someone interested in expanding similar family restaurant operations to other cities. My cover was as a food blogger writing about immigrant family businesses, a role that would allow me to spend time with Maria and her children while documenting their situation. The first visit to Santos' family restaurant was heartbreaking. Maria Santos was clearly a hardworking woman who had immigrated to Chicago with dreams of providing her children with better opportunities than she'd had. The restaurant was clean and welcoming, filled with family photographs and decorated with artwork the children had created over the years. But I could see the fear in Maria's eyes, the way she jumped every time the door chime announced a new customer, the careful way she monitored her children's movements and interactions. This was a woman living under constant threat, trying to protect her family while being forced to participate in activities that could destroy everything she'd worked to build. Carmen, the 16-year-old daughter, was clearly the academic star of the family. Her homework was spread across a corner table, and I could see college preparation materials mixed in with her regular assignments. She had the kind of focused determination that reminded me of David at that age, and the thought of her future being destroyed by her mother's forced involvement in criminal activity was unbearable. Miguel, the 14-year-old son, was more outgoing but equally impressive. He helped serve customers with practiced efficiency, switching seamlessly between English and Spanish depending on who he was helping. Both children clearly adored their mother and took pride in the family business, having no idea that it was being used to process money for drug dealers and killers. Over the course of several visits, I began to piece together the full scope of Maria's situation. The Torino family had approached her during a particularly difficult financial period, offering immediate cash relief in exchange for allowing their associates to hold private meetings in the restaurant's back room. The arrangement had escalated gradually, with increasing amounts of money being processed through the restaurant's accounts and increasingly specific threats about what would happen to her children if she tried to withdraw from the operation. "They know where Carmen goes to school," Maria confided to me during our third meeting, speaking in Spanish and keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "They know Miguel's soccer schedule. They know what time I pick them up every day. There's no escape from people who watch your children like that." The conversation was being recorded by equipment Frank had hidden in the restaurant during his equipment consultation visit. Every word would become evidence in the eventual prosecution of the Torino family. But more immediately, it was documentation of the psychological torture being inflicted on an innocent family. Marcus had been developing relationships with other business owners in the neighborhood, identifying additional families who were trapped in similar situations. A dry cleaner, a small grocery store, a construction company. All family-owned businesses that had been converted into money laundering operations through a combination of financial pressure and threats against loved ones. The pattern was always the same. The Torino family would identify struggling businesses owned by families with children or elderly relatives. They would offer financial assistance that seemed too good to refuse, then gradually increase their involvement until the business owners were completely trapped. Any attempt to escape was met with specific, credible threats against family members. But the most disturbing discovery came when Marcus recognized one of the Torino associates from his days working with Tyler in Portland. Vincent Corelli had been using Tyler's operation as a training ground, learning how family dynamics could be exploited and refined for use in larger criminal enterprises. Tyler wasn't just a local criminal, Marcus explained during one of our evening debriefing sessions. He was a test case. The Torino family was studying how he manipulated Emma's family, how he used Rachel's relationship with David to gain access to the trust fund money. They've been using those techniques to expand their operations across the entire Midwest. This meant that David's murder had provided the Torino family with a blueprint for victimizing other families, that his death had inadvertently contributed to the suffering of hundreds of other people. The knowledge was almost unbearable, but it also reinforced the importance of what we were doing. Stopping the Torino family wouldn't just prevent future victimization, it would ensure that David's death couldn't be used to harm any more innocent families. Agent Novak had been coordinating with federal prosecutors to prepare for a massive, coordinated arrest operation. The plan was to simultaneously raid 37 businesses across 6 states, seizing evidence and arresting over 100 suspects, while ensuring the safety of the victimized families. It would be one of the largest organized crime operations in FBI history. But first, we needed to gather enough evidence to ensure that the prosecutions would succeed. Financial records, recorded conversations, surveillance footage, and most importantly, testimony from the families who had been forced to participate in the criminal enterprise. Convincing these families to cooperate with law enforcement required delicate negotiations. They had to be assured that their children would be protected, that their businesses wouldn't be destroyed by the prosecutions, and that they wouldn't face criminal charges for their forced participation in money laundering operations. The breakthrough came when Maria Santos agreed to wear a wire during a meeting with Vincent Corelli, capturing his explicit threats against her children and his detailed explanation of how the money laundering operation functioned. The recording was devastating evidence that would not only convict Corelli, but also demonstrate the coercive nature of the entire enterprise. "Your brother would be so proud," Frank told me as we listened to the recording in Agent Novak's office. "David started documenting one family's theft, and now we're bringing down a criminal organization that spans half the country." The coordinated raids took place on a Thursday morning in early spring, exactly 6 months after we'd arrived in Chicago. FBI agents hit all 37 locations simultaneously, arresting suspects and seizing evidence, while specially trained family protection teams ensured that the victimized children and elderly relatives were immediately placed in secure locations. The operation was flawless. Vincent Corelli was arrested at the Santos restaurant, caught in the act of collecting laundered money. The Torino family leadership was taken into custody at their compound outside Chicago. Dozens of other criminals throughout the network were arrested without incident. But the most satisfying moment came when I was able to tell Maria Santos that her children were safe, that they would never again have to live in fear of criminal retaliation, and that her restaurant could return to being the honest family business she had always intended it to be. Standing in the Santos family restaurant after the arrests, watching Carmen and Miguel hug their mother with tears of relief streaming down their faces, I felt David's presence more strongly than I had since the day we'd found his journal. His documentation had started a chain of events that had ultimately freed hundreds of families from criminal coercion. The Torino family members were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vincent Corelli received 40 years for his role in David's murder and the subsequent criminal enterprise. Dozens of other criminals received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. More importantly, the victimized families received protection, financial assistance, and help rebuilding their businesses free from criminal influence. The David Chen Foundation established a special fund to provide long-term support for families who had been coerced into criminal activity, ensuring that their cooperation with law enforcement wouldn't result in financial devastation. Maria Santos sent me a photograph 6 months later showing Carmen receiving a full scholarship to Northwestern University. Miguel had been accepted into a special program for academically gifted students. The restaurant was thriving, serving authentic family recipes without the shadow of criminal activity hanging over every transaction. Each success story reminded me that David's death had meaning beyond the immediate punishment of his killers. His courage in documenting the truth had created ripple effects that continued to protect families across the country, ensuring that his sacrifice would serve justice for generations to come. As I flew back to Portland after the successful conclusion of the Chicago operation, I realized that my understanding of David's legacy had evolved once again. He hadn't just died trying to protect our family's money. He had died defending the principle that families should be able to trust each other, that financial relationships should be based on honesty rather than exploitation. That principle was now protecting hundreds of families who had never heard David's name, but whose lives had been saved by the evidence he had died gathering. His story would continue, his mission would expand, and his influence would reach people he could never have imagined helping. The scared sister who had found his journal was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that justice was not a destination, but a journey, that protecting others required constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to the truth. David's work was far from finished, and neither was mine. But every family we saved, every criminal we exposed, every victim who found justice was proof that his sacrifice had created something larger and more lasting than either of us could have anticipated. 7 years had passed since David's murder, and the foundation bearing his name had grown into something neither of us could have envisioned during those dark days in his empty apartment. What had begun as a quest for justice for one family had evolved into a national network of investigators, attorneys, and advocates who specialized in uncovering financial crimes that traditional law enforcement often overlooked. The Chicago operation had been a turning point, demonstrating that individual cases of family betrayal were often connected to larger criminal enterprises. Since then, the David Chen Foundation had assisted federal law enforcement agencies in dismantling 12 major organized crime networks, protecting over 3,000 families from financial exploitation, and recovering more than $40 million in stolen assets. But success had brought unexpected challenges that I was still learning to navigate. The Foundation's growing reputation had made us targets for criminals who saw our work as a threat to their operations. Death threats had become routine, security protocols were now a daily reality, and the weight of protecting not just our clients but our own staff had transformed the nature of our mission. Frank Morrison, now in his 70s but showing no signs of slowing down, had assembled a security team that operated with military precision. Former federal agents, retired police detectives, and private investigators who specialized in protecting witnesses formed a protective network around our operations. The old building superintendent who had helped me break into Tyler's auto shop had become the director of what was essentially a private intelligence agency. Sarah Martinez continued to serve as our legal architect, but her role had expanded beyond individual cases to include policy advocacy and legislative reform. She spent half her time in Washington, D.C., working with congressional committees to draft laws that would make it easier to prosecute family financial crimes and provide better protection for victims of organized criminal coercion. Marcus Webb had surprised everyone, myself included, by becoming one of our most effective investigators. His intimate understanding of criminal psychology and financial manipulation techniques had helped us crack cases that had baffled traditional law enforcement for years. More importantly, his genuine remorse for his role in David's death had transformed into a fierce dedication to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The Foundation now operated from a secure compound in the hills outside Portland, a facility that combined office space with living quarters for staff and clients who needed temporary protection. The location was chosen for its defensibility and privacy, but also for its view of the Columbia River, where David's body had been recovered. Every day we could look out at the water and remember why our work mattered. Our latest case had brought us full circle in ways that were both satisfying and deeply disturbing. Vincent Corelli's arrest in Chicago had led to the discovery of a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of several state governments. Politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials across the Pacific Northwest had been receiving payments from organized crime families in exchange for protection from prosecution. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving elected officials I had voted for, judges who had presided over cases I had followed, and police officers who had investigated crimes in Portland neighborhoods I knew well. The realization that David's killers had been protected by corrupt officials for years made his murder feel fresh and immediate all over again. But the investigation also revealed something that brought me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The decision to kill David hadn't been made by Tyler Brooks alone. Vincent Corelli had ordered the murder after learning that David had photographed him during one of his meetings with Tyler. The killing had been authorized at the highest levels of the Torino crime family, making David's death part of a much larger pattern of eliminating witnesses who posed threats to organized criminal enterprises. This information had been crucial in securing federal racketeering charges against the entire Torino leadership, effectively dismantling one of the most powerful crime families in the Midwest. More personally, it had allowed me to understand that David's death hadn't been the result of a moment of panic or a local dispute that had gotten out of hand. He had been killed because professional criminals recognized that his investigative skills and moral courage made him genuinely dangerous to their operations. The validation was important, but it also highlighted the risks we faced as the Foundation's work continued to threaten criminal enterprises across the country. Intelligence reports suggested that at least 3 organized crime families had discussed targeting Foundation personnel, and federal law enforcement had warned us that our success was making us attractive targets for retaliation. The threats were taken seriously enough that my daily routine now included security protocols that would have seemed like science fiction during my days as a struggling graphic designer. Armored vehicles, safe houses, encrypted communications, and bodyguards had become normal parts of life. The freedom to move through Portland anonymously, to visit David's grave alone, to maintain any semblance of a normal personal life, had been sacrificed for the sake of continuing his mission. But the sacrifice felt meaningful every time we helped another family escape from criminal exploitation. Each case we handled reinforced the importance of the work, even as it demonstrated the seemingly endless scope of family financial crimes across American society. Our most recent success story involved a case that had come to us through an unusual channel. Carmen Santos, the young woman whose mother we had helped rescue from the Torino family's control in Chicago, had contacted us about suspicious activity in her college dormitory. Now a junior at Northwestern University, Carmen had noticed that several of her fellow students were receiving large amounts of cash from family members while claiming to be struggling financially. Her investigation, conducted with the same methodical approach that David had used years earlier, had uncovered a sophisticated scheme in which organized crime families were using college students to launder money through university accounts. Parents were being coerced into sending their children cash that would be processed through student organizations and academic programs, creating a laundering network that operated on campuses across the country. The case had required delicate handling, since exposing the scheme risked destroying the academic careers of students who were unwilling participants in their families' criminal activities. But Carmen's documentation and our Foundation's resources had enabled federal investigators to target the criminal organizers, while protecting the victimized students and their families. Watching Carmen testify before a congressional committee about the need for better protection of college students from organized crime recruitment had been one of the most profoundly moving experiences of my career. The terrified teenager I had met in her mother's restaurant had grown into a confident young woman who understood the importance of fighting for justice, who had chosen to continue the work that David had started even though she had never met him. The congressional hearing had resulted in new federal legislation requiring universities to report suspicious financial activity involving student accounts, creating another layer of protection against criminal exploitation of young people. Carmen's courage in speaking publicly about her family's experience had helped pass laws that would protect thousands of other students from similar victimization. But perhaps the most meaningful development had come through an entirely unexpected source. Rachel, my sister, had been released from prison after serving 8 years of her 25-year sentence. Her early release had been granted in recognition of her cooperation with federal investigators pursuing other cases related to the Torino family network. The letter she sent me upon her release was dramatically different from the self-serving communication she had written 5 years earlier. This time, her words carried the weight of genuine remorse and a clear understanding of the devastation her choices had inflicted on our family and countless others. She wrote about the impact that learning of David's connection to the Chicago case had on her understanding of what she had participated in. The knowledge that her cooperation with Tyler hadn't just been about stealing from her own family, but had contributed to the expansion of criminal enterprises that victimized hundreds of other families, had fundamentally changed her perspective on her actions. More importantly, she wrote about wanting to contribute to the Foundation's work, to use her experience and knowledge to help other families avoid the devastation that criminal financial manipulation could inflict. She acknowledged that she had no right to expect forgiveness or reconciliation, but expressed hope that her expertise might somehow serve the cause of justice that David had died defending. The decision about whether to allow Rachel to participate in the Foundation's work had been the most difficult I had faced since David's death. Sarah had argued that her cooperation could be valuable, that her insider knowledge of how families were targeted and corrupted could help us develop better protective strategies. Frank had been more skeptical, concerned that Rachel's presence would compromise the Foundation's reputation and effectiveness. Marcus had provided the perspective that ultimately influenced my decision. She helped kill David, he had said during one of our planning meetings. But so did I. The difference is that I've spent 8 years trying to make amends, while she spent 8 years in prison learning about the full scope of what we participated in. If we believe people can change, if we believe redemption is possible, then we have to give her the same opportunity we gave me. I had ultimately decided to allow Rachel to work with the Foundation, but under strict conditions. She would be assigned to cases that didn't involve direct client contact, focusing instead on research and analysis that could benefit from her understanding of criminal family dynamics. Her work would be closely supervised, and any indication that her presence was compromising our effectiveness would result in her immediate removal from the program. The arrangement had proven more successful than anyone had anticipated. Rachel's insights into how criminals identified and targeted vulnerable families had helped us develop early warning systems that prevented victimization before it could begin. Her analysis of financial manipulation techniques had improved our ability to trace stolen assets and build prosecution cases. Most importantly, her detailed knowledge of how Tyler and the Torino family had operated had helped federal law enforcement agencies identify and dismantle similar criminal networks across the country. Working alongside Rachel had been emotionally challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Seeing her every day forced me to confront the complicated reality that the sister who had betrayed our family was also the sister who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had comforted me after nightmares, who had held my hand at our parents' funeral. The woman who had helped kill David was also the woman who was now dedicating her life to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The psychological complexity of maintaining a professional relationship with someone who had so profoundly damaged my life required constant emotional management. Therapy sessions with specialists who understood trauma related to family betrayal became a regular part of my routine. The Foundation provided similar support for other staff members who were working with former criminals or dealing with the psychological impact of investigating family financial crimes. But the personal challenges were balanced by the professional benefits of having Rachel's expertise available. Her understanding of criminal psychology had contributed to the successful resolution of dozens of cases, and her ability to anticipate how criminal families would respond to investigation had helped us protect witnesses and gather evidence more effectively. The 10th anniversary of David's death arrived on a crisp October morning, marked by our largest memorial service yet. The small chapel that had hosted his original funeral could no longer accommodate the hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his legacy. Instead, we held the ceremony at the Portland Convention Center, filling an auditorium with families we had helped, law enforcement officials who had worked with us, and advocates from across the country who were fighting similar battles in their own communities. Agent Patricia Novak delivered the keynote address, describing how David's documentation had revolutionized federal approaches to investigating organized crime infiltration of family businesses. Federal prosecutors from 12 different jurisdictions shared statistics about criminal networks that had been dismantled using techniques developed from David's evidence. Academic researchers presented studies showing how the Foundation's work had influenced national policy regarding family financial crime prevention. But the most powerful moments came when family members who had been helped by the foundation shared their stories. Maria Santos, now a successful restaurant owner whose children had both graduated from college, spoke about how David's sacrifice had enabled her family's freedom. Carmen Santos, now in law school and planning to join the foundation's legal team after graduation, described how David's courage had inspired her own commitment to justice. Dozens of other families shared similar testimonies, creating a chorus of voices that demonstrated the far-reaching impact of David's decision to document the truth rather than ignore the criminal activity he had discovered. Each story reinforced the understanding that individual acts of courage could have consequences that extended far beyond their original context. The memorial service concluded with the unveiling of a new initiative that would expand the foundation's work internationally. Criminal families that specialized in financial exploitation were increasingly operating across national borders, victimizing immigrant families who had limited access to American law enforcement protection. The David Chen International Justice Project would work with law enforcement agencies in Canada, Mexico, and other countries to identify and prosecute criminal enterprises that targeted immigrant families living in the United States. Standing before the assembled crowd, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by David's legacy, I realized that my brother had achieved a form of immortality that few people ever attained. His influence would continue to protect families, expose criminals, and serve justice for generations after everyone who had known him personally was gone. The scared, confused young woman who had entered David's empty apartment 10 years earlier would have been overwhelmed by the scope of what his death had ultimately accomplished. But the person I had become through years of seeking justice understood that this was exactly what David would have wanted, not personal recognition or fame, but the knowledge that his sacrifice had created lasting protection for people who needed someone willing to fight for them. As the memorial service ended and people began to file out of the auditorium, Frank approached me with a manila envelope that looked remarkably similar to the one David had hidden behind Tyler's tool cabinet years earlier. "What's this?" I asked. "A new case," Frank replied with a slight smile. "A family in Seattle, being victimized by people they trusted. They heard about the foundation through Carmen Santos, and they've been documenting everything just like David did." I opened the envelope and found photographs, financial records, and handwritten notes that demonstrated the same careful attention to detail that had characterized David's investigation. Another family was fighting back against criminal exploitation, using the techniques that David had pioneered and that the foundation had refined through years of experience. "They're ready to fight," Frank continued. "They just need someone who understands what David went through, someone who can help them finish what they've started." Looking at the evidence, I felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven me through every case we had handled. David's work was far from finished, and neither was mine. There would always be another family to protect, another criminal enterprise to expose, another opportunity to ensure that David's sacrifice continued to serve justice. The Chen siblings had promised to always take care of each other, and that promise had evolved into something much larger than either of us had ever imagined. David's courage had created a legacy that would protect families forever, and my commitment to continuing his mission would ensure that legacy never stopped growing. As I walked out of the convention center into the Portland sunshine carrying the evidence of another family's fight for justice, I whispered a quiet promise to my brother. "We're not done yet, David. We're just getting started." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.